Pierre Michel Falké was born in 1884 in Paris, but he grew up in New Caledonia, a group of islands in the South Pacific which had been colonised by France and originally used as a penal colony in the 1860s. As nothing else seems to be written about his life, I can't tell you why he grew up there or where, if anywhere, he studied art. But by 1907, when he would have been in his early 20s, he was back in France and having his work published in various Parisian humorous magazines. All his output at this time was comedic in nature and drawn with a naive but expressive technique, which appears to have been fairly genuine rather than a matter of choice, as I found not one example of his work, humorous or otherwise, indicating that he could actually draw in the conventional sense of the word. But in stylistic terms, he was in very good company among his contemporaries, many of whom were also pushing humorous illustration away from the more studied and hatched styles prevalent in the magazines of the 19th century. Among other achievements of this period, in 1909 he was offered his own complete issue of L'Assiette au Beurre, and the images he created made for an entertaining collection on the theme of military healthcare, printed in just 2 colours and featuring some ribald and fairly unsubtle dialogue. L'Assiette wasn't his only client, but 2 years later in 1911 he appeared again in his own issue, this time with a bonus 3rd colour and a collection of jokes about the antique business. Like the earlier military series, the humour was broad, and although it held the business up to ridicule, it was far from scathing and actually quite good-natured. And it was exclusively with comical drawings such as these, making fairly light-hearted fun of his fellow humans across all aspects of French society, for L'Assiette and others such as Le Sourire and Le Rire, that he made a good living for the next few years. But in 1914 the Great War began, at which point Falké signed up to join the army, and fought in the appalling conditions in the trenches alongside his countrymen. But even while doing so, he continued to create bleakly humorous illustrations, which not only made fun, if you can call it that, of the situation, but which also served as a poignant record of the horrors endured. Among other battles he fought at the Somme, a notoriously bloody encounter, and he created this particularly memorable bleak image titled The Grenadier. Following Germany's defeat and surrender in 1918, Falké returned to civilian life and carried on where he'd left off for the next couple of years. And while continuing to pursue that career, he created this poster from 1920's Salon du Humoriste exhibition, in which he was a significant presence. But in that same year he designed this book cover for an edition of Bram Stoker's Dracula, and its publication seems to have triggered a move away from humour into more serious-minded book illustration. And in 1921 alone he was responsible for creating images for no less than 3 novels published as limited editions. Louis Chardon's novel Terre de Chenin was a complex adventure story involving travel by sea from France to exotic and frequently dangerous locations, and Falké's jungle scenes, which unlike his earlier cartoon work were created as wood engravings and coloured using the pochoir stencil method, were very plausibly evoked visualisations of Chardon's narrative. I couldn't find much in the way of evidence for his edition of Raymond Descholier's culinary-themed novel Cantigrill, but what little I did find revealed they were also produced using the same technique. The narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, written by Edgar Allan Poe in 1838, also yielded little visual material, but there were both monochrome and colour versions of the same images, suggesting there may well have been 2 suitably priced versions published. In 1922, another novel by Louis Chardon, Le Pot au Noir, featured more distinctive images from Falké. Like the previous year's book, the narrative took place in exotic distant locations, and although the pochoir process had the unfortunate effect of slightly obscuring the solid black underneath, the illustrations nevertheless sang with their vivid colouring, and this was a particularly memorable collection. And just when it seemed that he had become somewhat typecast, in 1924 Falké turned to the use of etchings to illustrate Roland Dorgel's doom-laden novel The Awakening of the Dead. This method of image making produced much finer line work, executed as scratchy expressionistic drawings, and the process encouraged him to use hatching to create the illusion of tonal effects not possible with wood. I found just one example of a comparatively unimpressive press advertisement created in 1925 and an equally uncommon cartoon from Fantasio magazine in the same year. But otherwise it was bookwork which held his interest, and it was in that year that yet another novel by his friend Louis Chardon was published. This was Le Maître de Navire, another seagoing tale with a collection of appealingly blockish wood engravings, which I found examples of reproduced in both monochrome and colour, so probably two limited editions priced accordingly. They showed quite clearly that however attractive the coloured versions may have been, it was the basic black and white image which did virtually all the hard work. 1925 was also the year that Memories of Oceania, another limited edition of just 160 copies, was published, with more woodcuts of scenes inspired by his own early life in the South Sea Islands. In this instance, all the images I found were pure monochromes, but of course that doesn't mean there wasn't a coloured edition too. And the same was equally true the following year's The Long Walk of Samba Diouf by Jérôme and Jean Théraud. The story was an exploration of cultural and colonial themes, with a Senegalese protagonist who fights in the Great War for France. It was also in 1926 that his edition of Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe was published. It was another limited edition of just 160, aimed at serious collectors prepared to pay high prices. And for such a small print run, the pochoir stencil process was the only financially sensible means of colour reproduction. He followed this creative triumph in 1927 with the story Paul and Virginia, written by Bernardin de Saint-Pierre in 1788, about two lovers living in Mauritius, then called Île-de-France, and under French rule. For this project, a limited edition of 135 copies, Falké created the illustrations as engravings in copper, which, like etching, allowed for much finer delineation than with wood. The colouring in this instance is credited to Jean Saudet, who at the time was a well-known printmaker who had an excellent reputation for his pochoir technique. In 1930 he returned to his wood-engraved and pochoir coloured images for Claude Ferrer's 1905 novel Les Civilisés, about the lives of French colonial officers in late 19th century Saigon. And once more the exotic nature of the story and location brought out the best from Falké with a series of compelling images. A year later he was chosen to illustrate one of 10 volumes of the collected works of the writer Georges Courteline, and the images he created for this commission were used to illuminate a much wider range of subjects and historical periods than usual. There was a large volume of scratchy but descriptive monochromes, some of which were printed as small spot illustrations set within the text, and others which were full-page images. Additionally, there were several full-colour pages, and although I could find no definitive information regarding the technical process used in their reproduction, it's clear they were either etched or more likely copper engraved and pochoir coloured as usual. In 1932 he illustrated 2 novels with swashbuckling adventure themes using the same technique. Claude Ferrer's seagoing story Thomas Lanolet, Gentleman of Fortune, inspired a collection of typically expressionistic, flawlessly researched period images. And Falké achieved precisely the same qualities and narrative energy for his visualisation of Alexandre Dumas' classic story of the Three Musketeers. In 1933 he returned to more humorous output with a comically dramatic fishing joke for Fantasio, and this Parisian cafe scene for the cover of Le Rire, and these were the last such examples I could find. In 1934 Falké illustrated both volumes of Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book, and this was undoubtedly among his greatest creative triumphs. Whether its financial success mirrored that, I have no idea, but it was a collection of absolutely engrossing images, which perfectly combined heavy black engraved line work and larger solid areas, with additional bright colour washes to make for particularly satisfying visual evocations of Kipling's classic tale of Mowgli and the animal inhabitants of the Indian jungle. For some unknown reason, his next published work wasn't until 1938, with Francis de Croiset's novel The Lady of Malacca, which provided Falké with yet another excuse to create wood engravings, this time in a luxuriant Malaysian setting, even if he was in this case apparently limited to just black and white. But the same year also saw a return to the writing of Rudyard Kipling, with an edition of The Bridge Builders, and also a return to the application of copper engraving to create the line work. Consequently, the images were considerably lighter of touch than those produced for the Jungle Book, and in their own way they were every bit as striking in their appeal and atmospheric credibility. And 1938 was obviously a particularly busy year for Falké, as it was also the year in which his illustrated edition of Victor Hugo's classic tale Les Miserables was published, using the same more spidery graphic approach combined with loosely applied splashes of colour. A year later the Second World War was declared, and by 1940 the Germans had occupied Paris. It was in that year that the first of a 2-volume work about the lives of French historical figures, written by Pierre Falké, was published for school children. And despite its manifestly patriotic slant, it was allowed to be published by the Nazis, as it only concerned itself with the past and made no reference to the more contentious goings-on of the 20th century. In the same year he created this uncharacteristically cheerful poster, inviting charitable book donations for Christmas. And in 1941 he remained similarly upbeat in another poster, this one promoting the National Lottery. During the years of the German occupation, the only other book published with Falké's illustrations was Jérôme Jean Thorod's It Was a Small Ship, a blameless collection of songs which was published in 1943, and unusually the images were created as traditional stone lithographs. In the summer of 1944 the German invaders were finally driven out of France, and a year later Falké's illustrated edition of Pierre Macaulin's The Anchor of Mercy was published. This was an adventure novel about sea travel in the 18th century, and Falké's copper engraved images more than did justice to his friend's written narrative. In this instance the images appeared in a range of formats, from impressive more scenic double-page spreads through to closer quarter more character-based images as full pages and chapter headings. In 1946 Falké provided similar finely rendered images for Jean Gaultier Boissier's La Fleur au Fusil, which translates into English as the flower in the gun, a French expression referring to overconfidence in a perilous situation. This will be Falké's last published book commission, although in 1947 he also created his very last image, ironically a cheerful poster encouraging a healthy lifestyle, as that was the year he died of unknown causes at the age of 63. I've grown fairly used to not having much biographical information for quite a few of the subjects I've featured in this series, but Pierre Falké sadly remains the faintest shadow of a man, and I was rather dismayed and frustrated by how little is recorded about him. For all my own tendency towards what could be called more overtly commercial illustration, I find myself increasingly fascinated by the work of those who choose a more singular and personally expressive approach. And Pierre Falké was undoubtedly among those who deliberately pushed hard at the boundaries of what illustration might be, rather than a mere record of actuality. And I hope this tribute helps to bring his work to a wider audience than he seems to currently have.